Welcome to the Loadout Podcast with Aaron Perlet.
Thanks for joining us once again on the Loadout Music Podcast. My next guest needs no introduction. He is John Oates of the legendary Hall and Oates. John, how you doing today?
Hello, Mr. Aaron. Sir Aaron of St. Louis, Sir Mustache Purveyor of fine facial hair.
Oh yes, the old days.
Yes.
How are things in lockdown for you?
Well, we're healthy, and that's the main thing. So I can't complain about that. We are just trying to make the best of a challenging situation, like everyone's doing. But we're home, cooking a lot at home, obviously, and writing songs, trying to make the best of it.
Yeah, it's interesting. Having talked to numerous musicians over the last couple months, so many people are doing things that they're just not accustomed to, and largely that equates to being home because, you're used to being on the road constantly, playing shows every night, every other night, and it's not a natural thing for a lot of musicians.
So true. I mean, I started thinking about it. This is probably the longest period of time, constant period of time that I've been home since I became a professional musician in '72. Honestly, it's very unusual. So.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. But I guess there's some upsides to it. You get to spend some time thinking, actually, which sometimes you don't get to do that when you're working. So there's an intellectual benefit to it. So, where I'd like to start with is, I think so many people are familiar with, obviously, your partnership with Daryl and Hall and Oates, but I want to take people back to the beginning. You're a Philly guy. I know you and Daryl basically met in a club once, but I'd love to, if you could talk a little bit about just your upbringing and your influences musically, and what drove you to first get into music.
Well, Daryl and I collectively, and I guess individually, are known as Philly guys. I was born in New York City. My whole family is from New York. When I was 4 years old, my father's company got transferred to Pennsylvania. So he moved the whole family, but we were the only part of the family that moved to Pennsylvania. So I grew up in a small town in outside of Philadelphia, about 25 miles north of Philly. And throughout my childhood, we went to New York every weekend because my mom and dad were homesick, and they wanted to be with their family and their friends. So really, although I grew up in a small town, went to a small high school, but of course I was oriented toward the city immediately in Philadelphia as I got older as a teenager. And I used to go to the Uptown Theater and see all the great R&B shows, the Philadelphia Folk Festival. I absorbed the Philadelphia music culture from an early age, listening to radio. And then, as soon as I could, I went to Philadelphia, which coincided with going to Temple University. And that's where I met Daryl. Daryl was also a student at Temple University. So, interestingly enough, I lived in Philadelphia from 1968 until 1971, actually. And that's the only time I lived in Philadelphia in my entire life. Because the moment Daryl and I got our first recording contract in late '71, early '72, we moved to New York immediately and began to record in New York. So Daryl and I have never recorded in Philadelphia. So I know, I don't want to dispel the myth, so to speak. But what we're really about is the music of Philadelphia, and the musical influences of Philadelphia are so deeply ingrained in our childhood that, yes, we are from Philadelphia. So we're from Philadelphia artistically, but not necessarily, domestically. How about that?
Well, and for years, you guys have also put on a music festival in Philly, right?
Yeah, we started a few years ago. It's called Hoagie Nation. And if you know anything about the regional cuisine, the hoagie is one of Philadelphia's kind of marquee sandwiches. And so we thought we always used to make a joke when we travel around the world, and whenever we get into that area, New Jersey, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania area, we'd call it, we're entering the Hoagie Nation, because it's the only place in America where you could actually get a real hoagie and it was authentic. So we always had a joke about it. When it came time to name our festival, we decided to call it the Hoagie Nation Festival.
And you mentioned earlier that you would go see a lot of soul and R&B shows. I don't know if the casual music listener realizes just how influenced Hall and Oates music has been throughout the years by old school R&B. I mean, you can, if you really pay attention, from the licks in the music to Daryl's voice to the harmonies to you name it. I mean, your music drips with soul, but I don't think the casual listener really pays attention to that sometimes.
Well, I kind of alluded to that earlier when I said that, musically we're from Philadelphia, and that's the truth. Because, the music you hear as a kid growing up, Philadelphia had the best radio. Even back to the early 50s, it was one of the first cities to actually go on a full rock and roll radio format on AM radio, really in the early 50s. And of course, WDAS and WHAT were the two major R&B AM stations, which Daryl and I listened to constantly. They had a gospel show on Sunday, and of course, so that was really, that kind of informed everything that we did. On the other side of the coin, Philadelphia had a very, very active folk music tradition. The Philadelphia Folk Festival is going on 53 years now. I went to the very first ones back in the 60s. So I saw the great traditional American blues artists, Doc Watson, Mississippi John Hurt, Son House, Lightning Hopkins. So I was, I did both. I had the R&B thing, watching the great artists at the Uptown Theater on North Broad Street, and the Philadelphia Folk Festival and the coffee houses, seeing all the great folk performers. And my personal music is an amalgamation of all that. But man, I saw Stevie Wonder do Fingertips when he was 12 years old live. I saw James Brown, The Temptations, Sam and Dave, Otis Redding, The Miracles. Four Tops, you name it, I saw them. I saw them all live, and I saw what they did to the audience and how the audience reacted, and the way they wore their suits and their dance steps, and so it was just it was a musical education from the time I was a kid.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable. So you and Daryl meet because I think at the time, if I recall correctly, you were both in different bands and you were actually playing at the same club, and you would kind of bump into each other, and that's where where the two of you really came together and ultimately started recording music together, right? Close. Okay.
Very close. Daryl had a group called Temp Tones, and it was basically an a cappella group that sounded like the Temptations. I had a group called the Masters, and we were an instrumental vocal combo. And I had a record out called I Need Your Love, and Daryl had a record out at the same time. And they were both being played on the R&B stations, WHAT and WDS. So we were aware of each other. We were individually invited to go to a teenage dance that was hosted by a DJ. And we were waiting in the backstage. It wasn't really a backstage. It was kind of this ante-room to a ballroom. Along with us were the Five Stair Steps from Chicago, and a guy named Howard Tate, who had a record called Look at Granny Run Run. Pretty obscure, but cool. And so we were all kind of crammed into this room, and DJ was spinning records. Kids were dancing. It was in a really bad neighborhood in West Philadelphia. And a fight broke out, a gang fight broke out in the audience, among the kids. And so we basically jumped in an elevator and went down to the street level. And that's exactly how we met. Now, I know it seems like a legend in the making, but it's actually the truth. So, and I actually went back to that ballroom last year for CBS Sunday Morning Show. And I went back into that room for the first time since 1968. And it was unbelievable. It freaked me out. I started getting like chills. And the room was so small. And it was just this nondescript little place that in my mind and memory, it was this epic moment. But it was just this little crappy little room, But yeah, that's how it all started.
Do you think it felt smaller because here you go, 40, 50 years later, and you've played some of the largest stadiums around the world, and you go back to this club that at the time you probably thought, wow, this place is huge. But, perspective is everything, right?
Yeah, I mean, sure. For me, the very fact that our band was going to get a chance to perform live, with the big DJ in Philadelphia, that was a huge deal. So of course, everything seemed, bigger than life. Shortly after that, Daryl had kind of a backing band, and they kind of fell apart. Daryl asked me if I would play guitar as a backup to his vocal group. And two of the guys in my group got drafted into Vietnam. So my group effectively broke up. So really, Daryl and I kind of gravitated towards each other, and then his group broke up, and we just hung out, and we shared a couple apartments. We bounced around. We were hippies living in Philadelphia, crashing here and there, and not doing anything formal. We weren't formally working together or thinking of the two of us being an entity. Daryl was doing some studio work. I was playing in a blues band and playing in folk clubs. And then it wasn't until 1970 when I went to Europe for 4 months. And when I came back, I had nowhere to live. And Daryl said, "Why don't you come hang at our house?" And I went into his place, and he had a little upstairs room with a pull-out couch, and that's where his piano was. And there I was with a guitar, and there he was with a piano, and we started writing songs.
So many bands toil for years and years, and they might be together 10 or 15 years before they just get a sniff of the big time. You guys got traction pretty quickly, and I mean, early 70s, you had a record deal. You mentioned it earlier, you moved to New York. I mean, someone took notice that you guys had something, right?
Well, it's funny. It does seem like a very short time now. At the time, it felt like forever. Well, we were associated with a guy from Philadelphia who will remain nameless, who we had signed to as songwriters for $20 a week, and he was trying to promote us as a duo. And so we would go and play these showcases in New York City. We'd take the train to New York, and we'd play, or we'd go to an office, a record company office or a publisher's office, and we'd play we trot out our acoustic guitar, and Daryl would play piano. We'd play our little collection of songs that we had. And the reaction was always incredibly positive. Wow, you guys are great. We love your sound. It's cool. It's different. And we'd go back to Philadelphia. We'd be all pumped. And then a few days later, the guy would say, "No, they passed." And we're like, "Well, they seem to like us. What do you mean?" He'd give us some double talk. What we didn't understand was behind the scenes, he was going back to them and demanding all this money and all this stuff. And he was going to have us sign to him, not to the label. He was going to sign as a proxy to the label. And as soon as these labels and these various companies got wind of how this was going to work, they said, "No, we don't want to be involved with these guys." So it took us a while to figure out what was actually happening. When we did, we finally were so frustrated because we had done it on numerous occasions and got turned down every time. Couldn't figure out why. Daryl and I pooled our money together and flew to LA. We had never been to Los Angeles. I had never been on a plane. And we landed in LA, and we didn't know you needed a car. But we had made a connection. We made a connection with a publishing guy who we had met on one of those New York trips. And he came and met us at LAX, picked us up in his car, and let us stay at his house. We didn't even know this guy. I mean, this was real hippie stuff. So he took us around to various places in LA, and we were staying at the Tropicana Hotel on Santa Monica Boulevard, which is a legendary rock and roll hotel. And of course, not having a car, all we could do was walk from the Tropicana Hotel to the International House of Pancakes, which was about 2 blocks, and that was really it. Eventually, he said, "There's this guy I want you to meet. I think you'll dig this guy." And we said, "Well, who is he?" He said, "Well, he's an art dealer, but he loves music, and he's got a really good relationship with Ahmet Ertegun at Atlantic Records." And we were like, "Shit, at this point, we'll meet anybody we can meet." So this guy took us over to his house, and he had this little bungalow in right off Santa Monica Boulevard, not far from where we were staying. And very cool and very artsy, and he had paintings and sculptures. And we went out into this little backyard garden, and sat around and pulled out our instruments and played some songs. And he was like, "Wow, you guys are great." He goes, "I'm going to call Atlantic, and I'm going to get you on Atlantic Records." And we were like, "Really?" We said, "Okay." And so he did, true to his word. And what happened was he made a deal with Atlantic Records to have a custom label called Clean Records, which was like a little boutique label. And he said, why don't you guys go back to New York, and I want you to audition for the big brass at New York, in Atlantic, and we'll get this thing going. And that's what we did. So we went back, and Clean Records actually did release some records. They had Delbert and Glenn, who was Delbert and Clinton, who had a duo at the time.
Yeah.
And we got back to New York. We auditioned for Aretha Martin, Jerry Greenberg, the two main guys at Atlantic. And Daryl was sick that day. The piano was kind of out of tune. We thought, oh no, did we blow this one too? And at the end of this little session, we played a few songs, and Aretha Martin stood up and went, I want to produce them. He was Turkish. And he said, I want to produce them. And that was all it took. And we were like, yes, yes. And then we got the word a little later that, hey, do you want to be on Clean Records or Atlantic Records? And we're like, Atlantic. And so they did a nice deal on the business side of things, so the Clean Records got a little piece of the action. And we ended up being on Atlantic Records and began our recording career.
Going back to the anecdote you were sharing about the gentleman you were working with in Philly, it's remarkable how many musicians, especially back in the 60s and 50s and even into the 70s, just got totally screwed out of things like publishing rights, and they had no idea what was going on. I mean, look at John Fogerty. John Fogerty lost so much money. Do you ever kind of look back at that era and you're just like, what the hell was going on?
Aaron, Daryl and I are in the great tradition of the artist who didn't pay enough attention to the business side of things. It's an age-old story. It's happened to everyone. I mean, Billy Joel, James Brown, you name it. There's probably more artists who got screwed than not. This thing that happened with the guy in Philadelphia, that was only the beginning. That was the tip of the iceberg. That was nothing. That was daycare compared to what happened to us in the 80s and the 70s and 80s with our manager that later on. We got I don't want to go into it. If you read my book Change of Season, I detail a lot of what happened on the business side of things. But I always I look back on it now in a much more holistic and Zen kind of way, because I realized that even though it was bad and there was a lot of unscrupulous business dealings that were going on, it really put me where I am. It made me leave New York City, made me move to Colorado, made me find I got divorced. I got, married a wonderful woman who we're still together 26 years now, have a kid, build a house. None of that probably would have happened had I been super successful and maybe had more money back in the 80s and not got screwed out of it, because I probably would have been a different person. So when I look at it with the lens of history and time, it's probably the best thing that ever happened.
So it's fascinating you say, had I been more successful in the 80s, because I think when people think of Hall and Oates in the 80s, I mean, there's maybe five bands or performers that historically came out of the 80s, maybe 10, that you still remember those acts. And you guys are one of them. I mean, you guys, Madonna, Michael Jackson, U2, there's a handful, but I mean,
I really didn't say the right thing, Aaron. What I meant was, obviously we were very successful in the 80s. So that goes without saying.
But the bank account.
What I meant was the business side. I wasn't handling had I handled the business side of things and understood what was going on, I would have been more financially sound, but I wasn't. We got to the end of the 80s and there was a lot of, as things began to be uncovered, I realized that, there was a lot of bad things that had happened. So I had to dig myself out of a financial, issue. But here again, age-old story in the music business. So many of us have. But here again, digging out of that financial morass, so to speak, really allowed me to reinvent myself and become a different person, and allowed me to be here today the way I am.
Let's go back musically a little bit to to when you and Daryl were writing some of the music that, you know, historically that everyone, it just becomes synonymous with your name. When you look back on that just that collection of music that the two of you created in the 70s and 80s, that is still getting heavy airplay today. What is kind of maybe if you look back on a handful of your records, what do you look back on and say, God, that was a record I am so proud of, that there's one that you just really hold in your heart?
There are a few, I have to say. I mean, we've had a long career. You know, when we did our box set, I guess it was about 2006 or 2007. When I began to actually examine the body of work, it was astounding. It was astounding that we were able to write and record every year at least one album from 1972 until 1986, every year. And sometimes more than one album, with collections and live albums and compilations. So our output was phenomenal. And, you know, I'm just as proud of the deep tracks as I am of the big hits. But I will say that, you know, there's some moments that stand out, and I don't really listen to my old music, but the moments that stand out and the recorded moments that stand out not so much because of the music, they stand out because of the circumstances that the music was made during and under. The type of people I was with, the bands, the studios, the emotional moments that fueled a lot of the songs. So I go back to the Abandoned Luncheonette as 1973 because of the, you know, I consider that album it's one without a doubt my favorite album, and it's a album that I call the perfect storm of creativity for us. We had written a batch of really, really solid songs. We were with Atlantic Records and had one album under our belt, so we had a better sense of being in the studio. We had the mentorship and tutelage of the great Arif Mardin, one of the greatest producers in the world, who surrounded us with some of the most incredible and most the finest musicians in New York City. In the Great Atlantic Studios, with Gene Paul, the son of Les Paul, one of the pioneers of multi-track recording, being our engineer. I mean, everything just went like this, you know, and it was this incredible, perfect storm of creativity that was happening at that moment. You know, it's a once in a lifetime thing that happens. So that album, of course, stands out to me. The other one would be the Voices album, because it was the first album that Daryl and I decided we would produce ourselves. And we realized that we didn't need a producer anymore. The old paradigm of an artist being assigned a producer by the record labels, that was a 60s and 70s thing. We were over that. We said, we'll never get our music right unless we do it ourselves. And the commercial and, you know, success of the 80s run is a testament to the fact that we made the right decision by producing ourselves. We had also developed this incredible band, the 80s band, you know, with G.E. Smith and T-Bone Wolk and Charlie DeChant and Mickey Curry. That band was so good, and it allowed us to record in the studio with the same band that we toured with. And we had never done that prior to that. So we had always used studio musicians, which was fine because we made some good records with them. But you know, I just think that's that's a very important moment. And then I'll do one more because I could go on and on forever. I'm sure you're probably bored by now, but
not at all.
The Big Bam Boom album, which happened in the mid to late, you know, 85, 86. That was an interesting record because we were at the top of our pop 80s pop success, and the whole world was at our feet. Both, you know, from a popularity point of view and a technical point of view. And it was the birth of the new digital revolution. Digital recording it was in its infancy. We were still recording analog, but all these new digital sampling synthesizers, polyphonic sampling keyboards were being developed by Fairlight and Synclavier. And all of a sudden they were just saying, hey, use our stuff. Try this. You got to check this new instrument, you know. And they would come to the studio with an engineer and with a technician who could show us how to use them. So now all of a sudden we're combining this new primitive digital technology with the well-established analog technology that we've been so used to over the years. And so that album is a really groundbreaking record because we were doing digital sampling, We were doing sampling of drums and unique sounds, experimenting with mics and all sorts of odd things that we were doing. So for us, for me, those 3 albums mark a very important, kind of step through a career.
Yeah, and I think on Big Bam Boom, probably the song that came off that record that is most noted historically would be Out of Touch. And if you think about Out of Touch, you certainly, I think back to it, you hear a lot of synth in there. But when you think about that era of your music making, do you wish that maybe you would use, instead of synthesizer, using piano, using more analog instrumentation, or do you listen to that music from the 80s because it was very specific to that decade and say, I love this stuff, it was perfect for then? Like, how do you feel when you hear those sounds?
Instruments are like tools. They're like tools in a toolbox. If you're a carpenter and you're going to screw in a screw, you don't use a hammer. Okay, you use a screwdriver. That's a simplistic, description or explanation. But that's really what they are. When I listen to music from the 70s and the 80s, or any era for that matter, I know exactly what instruments were being used because they were the only ones available. When I listened to the Abandoned Luncheonette album, there's a grand piano, but there's a Fender Rhodes and a Wurlitzer, and they were the only keyboards we had. When I listened to the music from the 80s, there's there was the Moog, the ARP 2600. There was, here again, like I said, the Fairlight and the Synclavier we started using. But before that, we had Roland synths. And every year, a new Roland or a new Yamaha synth came out. The DX7 electric piano was a signature sound of the early 80s. So, of course, every band used them. And if I listen to any 80s band, I can identify every instrument because they're the same ones we had, because they were the only ones you had access to. So, of course, as a creative person, you always want to use whatever's available and the latest and greatest. And so that's what we did. It also, I think those sounds, I don't know if it's what came first, the chicken or the egg, but the 80s had a sound because of those instruments. And the instruments identified that the kind of, without sounding too high blown, the instruments, the sound of those instruments and the style of the playing describe the zeitgeist and the energy of that era. Listen to the 80s music. It's a lot of it's dominated by eighth notes. It's like gang, 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 gang. It sounds like it's manic, and it's like, and the tempos are fast and everything is tight. And then of course you had the drum machine. Mm-hmm. So now you've got perfectly aligned beats, which also is very mechanical and very, very much a signature of the 80s. There's not a lot of analog drum feel from a drummer, regardless of how good their time is. It's always going to have a floaty kind of thing. But now you've got the Linn drum and the Roland 808, just driving this dead-on mechanical beat. So it's really, it became the signature of the 80s, and in a way, to me, it sounds like the 80s, or maybe the 80s sound like that. I don't know. Chicken or egg.
Well, and what's interesting is I think today, and really over the last decade, you're starting to see technology play a much larger role in music, and you're seeing, two-man bands that are able to create the sound, create the sounds of a full band because they're using technology. Obviously, the technology in and of itself sounds different because it's more modern, and they're trying to create different sounds. But there's guys like Jack White that are holding on and trying to use tin cans to make weird sounds. But there's a lot of people that are just using technology today. And so it's almost history repeating itself to a degree.
Well, in the world of pop music, and I write with a lot of young writers, and I keep my ear to the ground when it comes to that. Of course, there's still the Americana genre. There's blues. There's people who still playing real instruments, vintage instruments. That goes without saying. But when it gets to modern pop, what I found is there's no longer a line of demarcation between the technology and the artistry and the composition. They're all one and the same. If you look at a modern pop song, take a look at the amount of writers that you'll find on a Katy Perry record or a Bruno Mars record. There's often 4, 5, 6, 7, sometimes even 8 writers. There's a reason for that, because they each do something different. One guy is a beat guy, and he comes up with something on a sequencer. One guy is what they call a top line guy, who might sing a melody over a beat. Another one is the engineer. And now the engineer's role has become so important, they've actually been co-opted as a writer and become a writer. So the engineer now is a writer too. The producer's a writer because he may be doing something on his laptop at night after the recording session's over, and he brings in the next day that's now incorporated and folded it into the track. So technology and the composition and the composition itself are really one and the same. There's no difference between the two. The songs cannot be, those type of songs and records can't be made without the technology, and that's just how it is. So there's modern young songwriters are really, they integrate the technology into what they do.
Yeah. So you guys are absolutely huge in the 80s and into the early 90s. And then there was kind of a quiet period for you through the kind of mid 90s and early 2000s. But 12, 15 years ago, all of a sudden, Hall and Oates starts to just absolutely blow up again. I know you've told me before that you're almost amazed at the size of venues. I mean, you're playing huge stadiums across the world today, and there's been this kind of rebirth of Hall and Oates and your following, and I mean that must be remarkably rewarding for you.
Well, yeah, I mean the very fact that we've been rediscovered by a younger generation, but at the same time have managed to keep our older hardcore fans is a miracle, and it's something I'm absolutely proud of, and I think it's very rare that groups or an artist can achieve that. Yeah, there's a lot going on. I mean, we really, you know, in the late 80s, we made an album called Change of Season, and we made an album called Ooh Yeah, neither of which were extremely commercially successful compared to our 80s music, but they really kind of they coincided with the beginning of the kind of the garage band Seattle sound.
Yeah, the Seattle sound.
And to me, it was you know, as good as it was and as exciting as it was to have something new, it was an anti-melodic type of music. Melody was not an important part of it. It was really about an attitude and an energy and a trash metal kind of approach, garage band kind of approach to things. I think Daryl and I were sensitive enough and smart enough to realize that our style of music that was very chordal, that had a lot of chordal complexity, and that had relied a lot on melody, would not really resonate in that musical world. And we stepped out of it. And it was really good for me personally, because it coincided with this financial comeuppance that I had and a bunch of personal things that I wanted to realign my life. That's when I left New York, moved to Colorado, and basically started my life again. I didn't want to be on the road. I didn't want to make music. Daryl was doing his own thing. I don't even know what he was doing during that period of time. But I was living in the mountains. I was skiing. I was hiking. I was surrounding myself with a group of people that had nothing to do with music, and I was living a different life. And it was the best thing that ever happened to me. So by the time the end of the 90s came around, Daryl and I were kind of getting a little more antsy, and we were like, yeah, maybe it's time to get back on the horse, so to speak. And we made an album called Marigold Sky. I think it was 96. My son was born. And it was kind of a testing of the waters. And Marigold Sky was a really nice record, but didn't really set the world on fire, and that's okay. But what it did was it said, hey, you know, we can do our own thing in our own way, and it was the first album that we released independently. We had no record company affiliation. So we were early, here again, groundbreakers in terms of being independent artists. We were indie artists in the 90s. A lot of people don't give us credit for that, but we did our own, we made our own records. We released them as we wanted to on our own label. Nobody was doing, really, not a lot of people were doing that in the 90s. So, and that set the course for us to go ahead in the future. And we said, you know what? We don't need to sell millions and millions of copies anymore. All we have to do is make records the right way and sell them to our people who really care about us. And if we can be satisfied with that, we'll be very successful. And that was our mantra kind of going forward.
Well, and of course, you know, flash forward a couple years beyond that, and the record industry itself disintegrates, and it really becomes, from a revenue standpoint for artists, it becomes all about touring. And enter, the next stage of Hall and Oates, where you guys are selling out massive shows worldwide. You're touring now every summer. I know obviously right now we've got a caveat with this, but you were supposed to be on the road right now on a big tour. And so, I mean, the whole business has changed, and you guys are kind of in a pretty good spot. Take out the what we're dealing with a pandemic. You guys are in a pretty good spot right now.
Well, we cut our teeth on playing live. We know how to play live. When we started, if you couldn't play, if you weren't a good musician and on your instrument, and you couldn't sing and you couldn't deliver live, you didn't have a career. There was no hiding behind a synthesizer or auto tuning or anything like that. So that's what we've done our whole career. And all of a sudden, there was a real premium that was being appreciated by artists and musicians who could go out there and deliver on stage for real. And to this day, we do not use any sampling. We do not use any artificial tracks. We have an incredible band, and they play. Everyone sings and plays. And that's what we bring to the table. That's what we've always brought to the table. And there's a high value put on that now. And even a younger generation who brought up on, seeing people singing to tracks and kind of used to that sort of thing. I think they have a greater appreciation for that, and it's being valued, and our ticket sales and our popularity has proven that there's something of to be really appreciated.
So let's talk a little bit about you outside of Hall and Oates, because not a lot of people. Well, there are people that follow you that know what you're into, but there's a lot of 80s Hall and Oates fans that don't know the Americana side of John Oates. You put out a pretty remarkable record a couple of years ago called Arkansas, the title track of which is a tremendous song. You and I have talked about that before, but the entire record from end to end is a really good record. And it, much like Daryl's first solo project when he got out of Hall and Oates, we'll just stick to the Arkansas record. It's so different from what you do together with Daryl that whenever we've talked about it, you seem like you have really found a passion with it and love exploring that part of your musical interests.
Yes. Well, thank you for saying that about Arkansas, because I'm very, very proud of it. But, if you go back to our early part of this conversation, when I was talking about the early days of Philadelphia, we talked about the R&B and the Uptown Theater and all that. But I also mentioned the folk clubs and the Philadelphia Folk Festival. What I did when I moved to Nashville, I was trying to find a musical identity for myself that could be discrete and different from what I do with Daryl. Because what's the point of, if you're not doing something different, what's the point of doing it? And what happened was, when I became part of the Americana community and began to meet and discover the incredible pool of talent and musicianship that was available to me, I realized that I could find kindred spirits musically who could allow me to go back into my earliest musical influences prior to meeting Daryl and reimagine those influences through the lens of where I am today and all my experience and my skill or whatever. And they got it, because that's the music they grew up on. So all of a sudden, I had this incredible community of musicians who I could draw from, and they could enhance what I was doing. And I realized that the key to me to finding a solo voice, so to speak, would be to go back, to go forward. And that's what I did. I began to examine all the things, and people would always say, they would say, well, how do you know how to do that? I mean, I thought you were a pop guy from the 80s. And I said, well, yeah, I am, but I also was playing guitar from the time I was 6 years old. When I met Daryl, I was 19. I was already playing for 12 years. So, I know how to do all that. I can play like Doc Watson and Mississippi John Hurt, because it's what I do. It's authentic and it's real. And I wanted to just bring that out. And that's what Nashville has allowed me to do. And that's what the Good Road Band, which is my Nashville band, which is incredible bunch of guys, have provided for me. So I'm very fortunate that I can have two separate and distinct careers, and that people actually allow me to do it. A lot of artists from the 80s and 70s, people won't accept them out of their box. And it's really rare, I think, to have that, but I fought hard for it. I fought hard and I made it happen because it's authentic and real for me.
It's great, man. So what's next? What have you heard about the summer tour? Is there an expectation that it's going to pick back up? What is your expectation?
My expectation is that it picks up and we can go back on the road. I love playing live and I miss it. And I know that there's an entire infrastructure of not only the musicians and the artists, but what about the technical people behind the scenes, the roadies, the technicians, the lighting guys, the sound guys, the truckers, the caterers. I mean, there are so many people involved with putting on a live concert, and they're all hurting, and it's terrible. And I really hope we come out of this and are able to resume some sense of normalcy. Right now for Hall and Oates, we have pushed back our tour incrementally because we wanted to see how the world was going to go. Right now, we still have shows on the books for July and going forward from July into the fall. We've taken some of our dates that we canceled or postponed in April, May, and June and pushed those back in October and November. So as it stands today, we're still going. If the world, if the audience does not want to go to a venue and sit shoulder to shoulder with a lot of people, I fully understand. And if that's the case, we'll react accordingly. But right now, as of July, we're planning on putting on let's go, baby. If that happens, it happens.
So the July shows are as they were originally scheduled?
Yep.
So I would believe, I think maybe it's July 20th or 21st. You're supposed to be here. So if that's the case, and all things say, we're going to have to do something like this again, but you're going to have to play some music at the gas.
I don't have any problem doing that. But Live Nation, who is our concert promoter, they are testing the waters from a business point of view. They're finding out whether there's an audience out there who wants refunds and are too nervous or uncomfortable with going back to a live show. And if it's a day-to-day thing for us. The needle moves day to day to day. So we're keeping our ear to the ground, and we'll see if May, late May rolls around and we were sensing that people don't want to be in a concert situation in July, then unfortunately we'll move. We'll pivot, and that's how we are.
And do you have any plans tentatively for late next fall, early winter to potentially do solo touring?
No, I'm not going to do any solo touring this year. I was really fortunate that I got in my last solo tour in November and January of this year with the Good Road Band. And it culminated in an amazing show on January, I believe it was January 9th, at the Station Inn in Nashville, which is one of my favorite venues. And in fact, it's where I first got the band together. So it was kind of coming full circle. And we recorded it. We have some great video, but we have an amazing live audio album that I'm going to put out next year, live from the Station Inn. And we're mixing it right now, and it's amazing. It's really it's a chance for hopefully people to hear this incredible band that I was fortunate enough to develop over the past couple of years.
Very cool. John Oates, you've said it all. Thanks for your time as always. Thanks for being on the Loadout Music Podcast. And hopefully when you're here in July, we'll do this again, but we'll do something live with a little music at the Gaslight, right?
Yeah, man. Well, let's do an update, and in the meantime, keep watching my Instagram page because I've got some cool stuff. Now I got some cool stuff happening, and I've got a new thing that I'm doing called Car Elaboration, where I'm going to do a dedicated motorsports page where I'm going to be interviewing legends of the motorsport, and we're going to be doing. I'm going back into my books of vintage car racing photos and things like that. So that's my other passion. So I'm going to indulge myself and check out Car Elaboration. It's coming.
Yeah, and if you go to John Oates' official Instagram, you can see a lot about his passion for old cars. Because you've got a couple, and you can get to know more about you, and you see a lot of great personal stuff.
Thank you.
Hey.
It's gonna be fun. Let's reconvene, Aaron, and hopefully we're we're going to be playing live in St. Louis and all points. So,
John Oates, thank you again.
yeah, man. Thank you.